Yes, Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
Could I ask you just one or two questions about arrangements for officers attending Victoria Hospital? We have heard that DC Connell went to the hospital, I think in the ambulance with Mr. Bio, and he was later relieved by a DC Balsillie and a DC Brown. Were you involved in relieving him from his duties at Victoria and sending other officers?
No, I wasn't. I think up until the time of the first goal group, I was of the position that DC Connell was still at the hospital.
Right. So you didn't have any involvement with DC Balsillie? Thank you. Can I ask you to look at your first statement, please? Your first inquiry statement, which is SBPI 133, and look at paragraph 27. And you'll see you're talking there initially about your position. You'd been a DC for a number of years and your promotion and such like. I'm interested in the latter half of that paragraph, 27. You're talking about finding out where your weaknesses are, and you talk about going back to frontline duties. And you then say, pretty much unremarkable in terms of any dealings with Alan Payton. He was a cop on the shift. He was tasked out, he did his job, pretty laid back. There was nothing dynamic about him. Was he capable? Yes. But like other cops who have had a good, probably 10, 12 years service, negativity sometimes does creep in, but no worse than anybody else. When you describe negativity sometimes creeping in regarding Mr. Payton, what did you mean?
Probably in general terms, in terms of the attitude towards the job. Again, it's a challenging profession. I mean, in terms of heavy workloads, getting the time to do inquiries, just general frustration. So some do become kind of disillusioned because of the challenges, but not in any way suggesting that transferred to the service that we were trying to deliver.
Did that negativity include negativity towards any particular individuals or members of a particular community?
No, not at all. It was more in terms of the workplace negativity, and again, from my experience, I think that when I first joined, older and more experienced officers would obviously tell you, well, one, question why you joined, secondly, and I think it was more whether it was terms and conditions that had changed when they had joined, that the job had changed effectively, and you could be influenced by that negativity, but obviously it doesn't change your own reasons for joining.
Looking at the negativity again, did it include, in your experience, any views that were discriminatory towards any particular individuals or members of community?
Not in the slightest. This is all internally in terms of the demands on the job, how the role had changed, and potentially terms, conditions, procedures.
And you've talked there about other officers who've got a lengthy service. You say 10, 12 years there. Did you have any experience of Craig Walker, PC Craig Walker?
At that time?
Or, well, at that time, yes. And would you say that we've heard that he was an officer who had a number of years of experience, years service. Would you say that your comments about negativity applied to him?
I think I would, in terms of the broader terms of the whole organisation, and again, it doesn't specifically to everybody, just a general feeling that as the longer you were in the service, things change. I think even just in terms of human nature, we don't always cope great with change. The role had changed and was evolving, again, just in terms of society in general, so it was always that resource numbers had changed, commitments had changed, so it was just a reflection of probably what was good, because you only had that baseline when you started, to how it had potentially evolved and changed. Not for all, but for most.
So in relation to PC Walker, again, were you aware of any negativity regarding discriminatory views for PC Walker in relation to any particular individuals or members of a community?
No, not at all.
Thank you. And I think for the Chair's benefit, you do go on to discuss this topic further in paragraph 28. And just at the end of paragraph 28, halfway down, you talk about officers becoming a bit despondent. Do you see that in the middle of paragraph 28? And you talk about the roles and responsibilities of a cop have just increased and just been added to all the time in terms of what we're expected to do. That's changing and keeping up with society as well. So you do get a lot of people that have done their time and are a bit sick of back shifts, but don't do anything about it. Can I ask you, first of all, when you say about officers becoming a bit despondent, you've talked about senior guys on the shift and becoming a bit despondent. Can you explain what you mean there?
I think that's just a perception, and again, I wouldn't explicitly say this relates to policing. I think it's any job. People like to moan about their job. Do they actually enjoy it in general terms? Probably yes, but I think it was more just the change in the conditions that they do, as I say, appear. And again, with despondent is they seem to know about the role they're doing. Do they have the ability to change that? Yes. Do they choose to? No. So again, are they actually quite satisfied and just want to moan? Again, but not anything that I would see that interfered or influenced how they then went and done their job.
Would you say that despondency that you're describing had an impact or an effect on their dealings with the public?
No.
Does it affect the culture within policing if more senior officers are despondent or of a negative mindset?
I could only relate from my own experience to say joining so young and having, as I say, potentially negative comments. I mean, young, enthusiastic, you kind of learn who you choose to align yourself to and who you would ignore, because there's obviously a lot of capable, experienced officers. Again, they all might have their reasons for bringing out that kind of negativity, but I think, as I say, I just align myself to people who encouraged me and obviously brought me on.
We've heard evidence from DS Dursley, as you know, 1st of March, and I asked him a number of questions about whether there were inappropriate jokes in the police service at times, in particular inappropriate racist jokes, and he said, yes, there is jokes like that in the past, but again, things like that have gone for me, you know, that's a time ago. And I asked him about the officers, and were officers hiding that type of thing from him now in his role, and suggested maybe it would be junior officers who would maybe hide inappropriate jokes from him. And his view was that he would like to think they were not doing that, especially the younger ones actually. Especially the younger ones, they're brought up in a different time where I think they are getting better. So and I asked if maybe it was the older ones that were hiding comments, but he said he wasn't saying that, but he thought the younger ones coming through were much more aware nowadays, and he thought they were not as bad as people thought. Was that something that you would agree with?
I would agree with and again, we joined at a similar age in terms of the culture. The late 90s, it was definitely different. Was there jokes in the workplace that were inappropriate, not exclusive to potentially race, religion, sex, misogynistic? Definitely. But they didn't originate from within the organisation, they would be brought in from society.
So that DS Dursley's comments do reflect your own personal experience?
Yeah, I think it would be remiss to say that it didn't exist, but not exclusive to policing.
Would you agree that perhaps younger officers are more aware of issues such as diversity issues than perhaps senior officers?
They're definitely aware, but again, potentially D.S. Dursley, with not having the experience I had with professional standards, is that having been involved in that kind of educational piece at the start of their training, we know that, again, as society evolves, the dynamics of our youth have changed as well, especially in terms of technology and social media. So we're dealing with a new issue. So I think it still goes on. Are they more aware that it's not accepted? I would say yes, as opposed to when we were when we first joined. There's definitely far more awareness and education of what is right and wrong, the standards that we expect of them as police officers. If they then choose, and we know it happened because I think it's in the media in terms of WhatsApp groups, and that's where day one when they're joining, the part of professional standards is to go in and reiterate and affirm the standards, the professional behaviour that we would expect from them as officers, and give tangible examples. In social media is a massive focus on that in terms of what we expect them and how they conduct themselves.
Your role now, I think you explained at the outset of your evidence, is about policing in the digital world.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's right.
So is this something that you're particularly up to speed on, in a way?
More so from professional standards, and again, really just from the issues that arise from that. So I think we're aware of, and again, not just in policing, in terms of WhatsApp groups, different messages. Again, we didn't have WhatsApp back then, we didn't have the same technology with mobile devices, so it provides a probably bigger opportunity for these, if there is things inappropriately to be shared, especially with imagery as well, that these platforms do provide that opportunity and a bigger reach, I suppose. It's then for how they conduct themselves on those platforms.
And would you include in that an opportunity for racist comments?
Yeah, not exclusive to race, as I say, sex, any of the protected characteristics.
Do the police monitor WhatsApp groups?
I think, well, I don't think we can. I think that's up for legal debate in terms of what we can monitor in general terms, in terms of the public or internally within policing.
And are you aware of issues in relation to the use of social media or different apps?
I'm aware of one specific case that's ongoing just now, I think, yes.
Right. I was going to ask you about that. Why don't we turn to that now,
Okay.
actually? I think, is this the case of BC and others against the Chief Constable? You might not know the name of it. Does it relate to 10 police officers
A number of police
WhatsApp
officers.
group?
Yeah. And is it Barkner, or I can't think, was there a ruling, or I think?
There was an original decision by a judge, a Lord Ordinary.
Mm-hmm.
It was appealed to the Inner House, which was to 3 judges, including the Lord Justice Clark. And I think there's another appeal to the Supreme Court outstanding.
Okay. That all happened before I joined professional standards, but was naturally aware because I think if there was any immediate tangible lessons learned from that no doubt influenced the messaging that we were given to new recruits and how we decided we would disseminate that within existing staff. And
From your records that you have a copy in your book, am I right in thinking that you joined professional standards in July of 2019?
that's correct.
And you were appointed as Chief Inspector of Professional Standards?
Yes.
And you continued in that role until 2021?
That's correct.
And the original decision by the judge, Lord Bannatyne, was issued on the 28th of June 2019. When in the July did you start as Chief Inspector at Professional Standards?
I can't recall. I think it was towards the latter stage of July, because I think it coincided with my holidays thereafter, so I started and then I was on annual leave.
So we're talking about roughly a month after the decision was released?
Yes, potentially.
And can we tell the dates from your rank,
Yeah, 2 seconds, I'll try and...
postings and training records, which were SBPI 00273? We could maybe have those.
Yes, it actually has got it down as the 1st of July. So whether I
Correct.
started then, had annual leave, and then started properly.
So officially, you started on the 1st of July
That's
2019.
the posting date, yes.
So that'd be a couple of days after this decision was issued by the judge.
Correct.
And it was 10 police officers against whom misconduct proceedings had been brought by the Chief Constable or the ACC under the Police Service of Scotland Conduct Regulations 2014.
Potentially. Again, my role was more in terms of investigations, which I was familiar with. Misconduct, and again, I'd never had any experience working in professional standards, so it was a steep learning curve. I had obviously a new role to get to grips with, so in terms of what you're quoting there, it wouldn't be immediately familiar. It's familiar now in terms of misconduct proceedings.
So you're familiar now about the misconduct proceedings that can be raised by the police?
Yes.
And at that time, it was the 2014 regulations. Has that changed since you were in police standards, as far as you know?
I don't think so.
So it was, in those days, in 2019 and 2020, it was the 2014 regulations. And the messages which had been found included racist, blatantly sexist, anti-Semitic, homophobic messages which were in flagrant disregard of police procedures, according to senior counsel who was representing the Chief Constable. So were you aware that part of those messages were racist messages?
Probably not in the infancy of PSD, as I had responsibility for the east of Scotland. I think it was just more management meetings where it would be discussed, but there was no time taken to bring me up to speed with it because I wasn't investigating it, I wasn't leading on it. And I think, as I say, I would just hear it referenced in management meetings.
I imagine that this was quite a hot topic of conversation at the time.
I think so, and it's like anything that emerges. If it's new and we need to respond, no doubt. Again, whilst any form of legal proceedings needed to play out, either external or internally, then if we're aware of an issue, what could we do to mitigate or prevent that happening elsewhere? So I know there was lots of discussion on how, I suppose, the police responded to this.
Was there other than in professional standards, was there an awareness amongst police officers generally about this situation which had arisen with WhatsApp messages?
Yeah, more or less, because as I said, in terms of standing up in front of new probationers, you would give tangible examples to give that reality, and not just give potential pitfalls, is actually show where their colleagues. And again, I don't know if we'd go into any great deal with that if it was ongoing, and whether we had to make it a bit more generic, not to give specific details, but for it to be as hard-hitting as possible, one, for them to get the message of what is expected, and to prevent them taking on any form of course action like that.
I mean, this situation gave rise to quite a lot of media interest, hasn't it, over the years since it was discovered. And obviously there's cases which have been reported publicly. And would you say there was a high level of awareness amongst the police about the existence of these messages and the problems that have been caused as a result?
I think so, and I think everybody could relate to the risks involved with being part of WhatsApp groups where obviously there's multiple members not being in control of obviously the content that was shared. If the content is shared and you respond to that, you become kind of complicit in that. And I can relate to even WhatsApp groups that I've been part of that I've very quickly come out of, and this is relating to obviously in society because I didn't agree with the content.
And is that something you reported to your line manager or?
No, because it didn't necessarily involve police officers.
All right.
As I say, just in terms of friends associated, which I've now potentially disassociated with.
Potentially.
But I have disassociated with.
So, as I understand it'll be a matter for the chair to read these things. I understand it was officers, including officers from Fife, that were involved in these matters. So if officers from a certain area get into trouble, do police officers tend to notice these things? Do they become aware of them through the media?
Definitely, and again, obviously the media reporting has evolved over time as well. I think in terms of prior to Police Scotland with Fife Constabulary, it was quite a small, compact police force, so you did seem to know about the majority of things, regardless of the content. With Police Scotland, naturally, with the bigger spread, you might not hear about things, unless there's obviously important internal messaging as a result, or if it appears in the media.
Right. I want to correct something that I've said. Apparently, they did seek to appeal to the Supreme Court, but leave was refused by the Inner House and on direct application to the Supreme Court. So I'm grateful to my colleague who's just advised me of that. So we've heard quite a number of officers give evidence to this inquiry who've said they know absolutely nothing about inappropriate jokes or comments or WhatsApp messages, and I've asked a number of witnesses about this. Can you explain how serving police officers would be completely unaware of the existence of what would appear to be a very well-known situation which has caused a lot of problems?
I don't want to comment for my colleagues. Again, I've obviously shared my experience and knowledge, which again I don't think is explicit to policing. It's society in terms of everything you're explaining there. I don't know with my experience now that I've got the confidence potentially to give my experience of stuff that I've been party to and heard. Again, with the fear factor potentially that, well, of the criticism, why have you not acted? But again, I don't know the circumstances. Ignorance, perhaps. I would potentially put it down to fear of, in this open forum, admitting that to some form of criticism to be levied.
And you mentioned earlier lessons learned, the phrase you used. In light of this situation which arose with the 10 police officers, was there anything done by professional standards when you were there, or by the police that you're aware of that became a lessons learned part of the process? You've talked about officers who are perhaps cadets being taught about WhatsApp and social media. Was there anything else that was implemented to avoid this situation arising?
I would only assume there would be internal messaging. And again, it's how we capture any form of organisational learning, because I've been involved in that. How do we best capture our officers, our people within the organisation, whether it's face-to-face, again, and we're limited because that's only, you capture a small audience. You've obviously got messaging through the internet, which I've explained before. Again, how do you then ensure that that has been absorbed and interpreted by them, if we're just signposting them to something? And then the online platform, perhaps. I know obviously there's a lot of matters being progressed just now with the force under the Policing Together banner.
Is that something that professional standards have had an interest in over the years, the ability of officers to absorb information and take the time to learn information? We've heard a number of officers give evidence who said they don't read all the SOPs, they don't have time. We've heard officers talk about emails that are always coming in, and just the general volume. Is that something that's concerned professional standards?
It's like any training, guidance, I mean, it could be there, they could read it, how they interpret it, how they apply it, what the takeaways from that, and everybody will be different. Again, as part of that training environment within professional standards for organisational learning, we looked at how do we best capture our people. So again, it was looking at various, not just the probationers, but other first line managers courses, because as part of the messaging to them in terms of sergeants and inspectors, you're looking for them to go and lead on those messages, deliver those messages, again to theirs when they go back to their divisions, departments, and cascade that and reinforce the messages of the force at that time.
So that's something that professional standards are...
They would play a part in, and again we've obviously got our training division as well at the college, which no doubt there would be close kind of working relationships there as well.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of the standards themselves, the 2014 standards, is it your understanding from your time in that department that officers do have to observe certain standards and comply with those standards in service?
Yes, definitely.
And for some of them, it's not just when they're on the job, but it's also when they're
Off duty.
in their off duty. And one of those is equality and diversity.
That's correct.
And constables should act with fairness and impartiality, and that they do not discriminate unlawfully or unfairly. And is that a standard that the service expects officers to comply with?
Yeah, and again, we know the purpose of Police Scotland, we know the values, and again, it's up for us to act in a way that we uphold and reflect on those values.
And if they don't uphold those values or observe those values, then there's an obligation on constables, officers, to challenge and report improper conduct.
Yes.
To report, challenge or take action against the conduct of other constables which has fallen below the standards of professional behaviour. Mm-hmm. So for officers who are maybe at work or even socialising with other officers, if they see discriminatory behaviour such as racist behaviour, the use of racist language or inappropriate racist jokes, would their obligation be to challenge that immediately and to report it?
Yes. And again, I would say that's their moral obligation as well.
And that's off duty as well as on duty?
Is this from more a police officer to police officer?
Yes.
If there were.
Yes.
Yeah, and again, I know there is obviously instances where the actions of a police officer off duty do come to the attention of the police and undoubtedly professional standards.
And that's something that be drawn to the attention of the professional standards department?
Yeah, because again, if it's off duty, an officer should be treated like no other. They should abide by the laws. I mean, if they were to commit offences, they are treated as a member of the public first and foremost, and that provides there's consistency around that in terms of, but also the recourse in terms of any internal misconduct element would be considered.
I'm interested in how an officer who had witnessed racist behaviour or language could report that to ultimately professional standards. Would they have to go through their line manager, or could they come direct to professional standards? So
again, that's evolved as well in terms I can only really speak to since having been in PSD in terms of the normal, because I think again, it's a society is how do you, the report mechanism, but also before you report something, do you have the confidence in reporting that? And more importantly, how do you go about that? So like any member of the public reporting to police, there's so many avenues. If they wish to remain anonymous, then there's mechanisms there. So I think we've had to, as an organisation as well, develop that process in terms of a direct, if you didn't have the confidence in reporting it to your line manager for whatever reason, the fear potentially of not being believed, the fear of being ostracised as a result, that there obviously has to be a mechanism to do that in confidentiality.
And thinking about the confidence of an individual to report it, you've talked about a number of fear factors there. Could that also be a fear of impacting your promotion prospects or your career progression?
It could definitely be a factor. And again, I could only relate to my early years of service, that if I was, would I have the confidence to do that? Maybe not.
You mentioned that it can be anonymous now. Is that, when did that come in, that you could...
I'm not too sure. It certainly seems to predate my involvement in terms of whether it's an email, a phone number.
And is that something that the professional standards were keen to observe, anonymity, and protect anonymity if someone requested it?
I think so, yeah.
And then you've talked about your role as investigating. Is part of the role of that department to investigate complaints that are made?
So my role specifically was on-duty complaints, and obviously to coordinate any off-duty complaints with the specific area where these had been committed.
Did you, in your experience, come across complaints about racist behaviour or conduct?
I don't think I did, no.
Were you aware of other investigations in relation to racism of any type?
I can't say I am, and given my involvement in this, I think it would definitely be something that I'd be alive to.
Right. What do you mean by your involvement with this?
Sorry, in terms of my lived experience through this, you know,
Right.
definitely my awareness has been heightened as a result. So I'm not to saying that at a level there might have been complaints dealt with a division that inappropriate comments were made that perceived to be racist, but in the same token sexist, misogynistic. Again, that it might have been dealt with at a different level and not involved me. Whether it was deemed to be, whether it was deemed to be criminal, non-criminal, and obviously then the misconduct consideration.
What happens if there are questions about a criminal prosecution? How does that impact on professional standards?
So if someone's committed an offence off duty, a criminal offence off duty.
So there's some sort of breach of standards by an officer on duty or off, and there's a question about misconduct proceedings involving the professional standards department, but there remains an issue about whether they're going to be prosecuted, for example. How do professional standards deal with that situation?
So again, and I think any suggestion or consideration of criminal proceedings, whether on duty or off duty, need to conclude effectively before misconduct proceedings can progress. But there is obviously mitigating measures, or measures that can be put in place to mitigate any associated risk. And restrictions could be placed upon that person, again, in terms of the depends on the circumstances. Duty restrictions that prevents them from being front-facing, depending on the circumstances, and if circumstances dictated and the gravity of it, suspension potentially.
So, is it the case that any question of criminal proceedings will bring misconduct proceedings to a halt?
Yeah, it's more a kind of timeline process that we can commence them in terms of notification of misconduct proceedings, or a misconduct assessment would be carried out on conclusion of the criminal proceedings. At that time, then assessment whether that was misconduct, gross misconduct.
Right, let me just stop you there. You said you can commence proceedings, and then you said or an assessment.
Yeah, so there's a procedure that you would, if there's a subject officer who is subject to a criminal investigation, you could provide notification to them that on conclusion of the criminal proceedings, misconduct will be considered.
How's that done?
It's carried out by PSD, ordinarily by the officers that are investigating, and that would be delivered to the subject officer.
Is it a letter
It's
or a
a
form?
kind of pro forma. I think it's a Regulation 9.
So if there are possible criminal proceedings being considered against an officer, how do PSD become aware of that?
Through various mechanisms, again depending on the circumstances. So as part of my role I carried out the on-call function, not dissimilar to the on-call function I performed on this day, but just a different role. That if, so say for instance it was off duty and dealt with police officers, you would no doubt then get a notification from that division that the officer concerned had been involved. Again, that's when the PSD considerations of what measures we need to put in place to mitigate the risk associated with the particular crime.
And whose responsibility would it be to get in touch with PSD to say officers may be subject to criminal proceedings?
Again, it would just be through those. So if it happened during the day, Monday to Friday, and the senior management team on in a particular area, that would probably be the conduit. If it's out of hours, weekends, that normally comes through the on-call function.
So some sort of contact with PSD, and then PSD can send a pro forma, I think you said, notifying of misconduct once they've considered whether to.
Yeah, it wouldn't.
Not automatic.
No. And again, there's a PSD gateway, so they are the central coordinating function of all those notifications to then decide, obviously, how that needs to be allocated. So
the notification would be sent to PSD. They would have a gateway to consider, and then would officers within PSD consider how to proceed at that stage?
At that time, in terms of if there was any kind of time critical actions to take place, as I say, if it was in terms of duty restrictions and or suspension, that's something. So for instance, if the criminal investigation was to proceed to that officer was to appear at court that day, next day, as I say, there's measures we probably look to put in place before then.
And in this situation where officers were advised that the Crown were going to consider whether to raise criminal proceedings, during that period would that be notified to the PSD and they would assess what to do about the situation? So if we were, if the inquiry wished to contact PSD and maybe find out what had happened in this situation, is there a particular department or person that we should be contacting?
I would say the gateway, but in terms of, I suppose officially the head of PSD is the Assistant Chief Constable for Professionals and Assurance. I suppose that would be your conduit to how it was
First port of call.
Best place, yeah.
And are you aware from your time in PSD whether there was anything done in relation to the officers that No. You're not aware, or you don't know if anything was done?
I don't know if anything was done. I would imagine, and again just with processes, that PSD would have been informed on the day as to any actions or considerations thereafter. Not, and in credit, obviously when I was within PSD, I was not on purpose not made aware of anything relating to the proceedings here.
That was nothing to do with you during your time there?
Just on to my involvement.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll be able to look into that. So I was going to come back actually to how someone would who would make a complaint of behaviour if they'd witnessed racist behaviour. But before I do that, is it automatic from your knowledge of PSD that criminal proceedings will take precedence over misconduct proceedings and pursuing them?
Yeah, I think so, because there was a time that we actually considered could misconduct proceedings proceed in parallel with a criminal investigation, and I don't think that was deemed to be appropriate and or lawful. I don't know.
Was that in a particular case, or just generally, was it a policy?
It was explored generally in terms of how to try and refine and make the process more efficient, because obviously there's extensive timescales potentially in criminal proceedings and how they come to a conclusion, and then thereafter misconduct proceedings. So again, from that, the lessons learned, potential feedback, that, and whether the impact on the officers' welfare, the witnesses involved, that we did look at how we could refine and revise the process to be a bit more efficient.
From your time in PSD, was there ever an occasion where, although criminal proceedings were being contemplated by the Crown, that misconduct proceedings had run in parallel?
No, as I say, I think it was explored and quickly negated.
So if it would appear there was a discretion to allow misconduct proceedings to continue in certain circumstances, you're not aware of any having actually been continued? No. And from your experience of a situation where misconduct proceedings are being contemplated by the ACC, but there is also an outstanding possible criminal prosecution, you've talked about different options for the ACC in terms of putting restrictions in place. And I think one of the restrictions you mentioned was suspension.
Yeah.
In your experience, is that something that's commonly done, or is it more common for officers to have their role changed?
I think, and again, just from my own experience, that the number of officers on duty restrictions would be far greater than the number of suspended officers.
Thank you. Right, I'd like to come back now to how somebody would go about making a complaint of racism. So, leaving aside the possibility of making an immediate challenge to an officer for behaviour or the way they've acted or something they've said, if somebody wished to raise a matter, how would they go about raising that matter and reporting that matter?
And it's the same process for any, so you've mentioned racism, or any inappropriate behaviour, actions. If it's in the workplace, then, as I say, I would suggest your first protocol is your line manager. So as an officer would be your sergeant. Again, if there was suggestion that the sergeant was anyway involved, you would maybe look to another sergeant, probably who you felt most comfortable in confiding in. So where that happens, but even before that, in terms of resolution, I'm also aware that people have resolved the issue by challenging the person themselves and resolving it between them. Whether that then been escalated to line management, I don't know. But I'm definitely, and that's only in recent years, and again I think it's how we've evolved and given people the confidence in various platforms to challenge any inappropriate behaviour.
And if somebody challenges an officer, who decides whether that is in itself sufficient or whether it needs to be reported?
So again, you're relying, if it's challenged between the people involved and it doesn't go any further, then I don't know how you can control or ensure that if there was line management aware, that may come from a third party. I don't know. And again, that has happened in circumstances. Again, I think and again only now my own line manager experience is that if the officer comes to you with any problem or issue, I suppose it's managing the expectations of what are they looking for you to do, because it would be a bit remiss if the fact that the actions you took thereafter weren't in keeping with how they wished it progressed or resolved.
So is it very much led by the wishes of the person making the complaint or the report?
Yeah, but I suppose as well to assist by giving a suite of options perhaps to how they would look to. Don't get me wrong, if the information was that we were going to take it out with their hands. Again, it's all part of that lines of communication of the reasons and rationale why that you couldn't ignore or give them an option of how this was to be progressed, and from that would just be what is overtly criminal.
Whose decision is it that whether or not it'll be taken out of the reporter's hands, the complainer's hand?
So again, it would be whether, like any kind of first form of disclosure, in terms of who then they choose to go and discuss, whether it's peer support from another person of the same. And again, I think the rank structure kind of would go out the window at this stage in terms of what discussions needed to take place and how they, if it required escalated, that would then be into the senior management team of whatever division or department it related to.
So if someone came to their sergeant with a complaint or to raise an issue, what does the sergeant then do?
So if it's to be escalated, and if it's something that this, again, based on the case-by-case basis, that the sergeant can't resolve, even in terms of performance action, in terms of, and again, there's sometimes issues that requires like mediation, and again, it's all in line with the wishes and expectations to start with in terms of the person that's coming to you. But naturally, escalation from there would to be his inspector, and that's just in line with the rank structure.
And then where does it go from the inspector?
So again, if it's depending on the time of day, and is it something that could wait? Is it something that's dynamic, urgent, that action needs to be taken there and then? I don't know, but you would then have a chief inspector, again in charge of that area department.
And where would it go from the chief inspector?
So above a chief inspector, you have a superintendent. And again, I think it was outlined in this that you've got the uniform superintendent, but if it's in the crime management world, you've got the detective equivalent of each rank.
Does it simply go up the ranks?
Yes.
Is there any option for someone to go straight to professional standards?
There is now, yeah. And there has for a number of years, that's existed.
Right. When did that come into?
As I say, it predated me coming, but I know there was mechanisms, and I know obviously heard of the term in terms of like whistleblowing, etc. And I know there's mechanisms for that as well.
In 2015, was it that route in place?
I'm not sure.
Well, we can maybe get more information from professional standards about these things. Could I ask you to look at paragraph 28 again? It's still on the screen. I slightly moved away from this paragraph, but I'd like to go back to it. We were talking about the phrase "a bit despondent" halfway down, and then you said, and the roles and responsibilities of a cop have just increased and just been added to all the time in terms of what we'd expect to do, that's changing and keeping up with society as well. So you get a lot of people that have done their time and are a bit sick of back shifts but don't do anything about it. Do these added responsibilities that you're talking about that have increased, do they cause you concern? The increase in these responsibilities?
They do. I think it's the pressures of any work, and obviously how you cope personally with that pressures, but also the support that you have in place to. Again, I think it's all like anything. I think when I first joined the police, the demand is always potentially outweighed the resource that's there to do it, and that's all how you then prioritise your work. Again, everybody has different ways to how they manage their workload. But I think, yeah, the landscape of policing has changed, but again, in keeping with society as well.
Do you consider that the weight of the expectations on officers nowadays is too great?
I think regardless of the weight of expectation, we've still got a service to deliver. That's the core function of policing in terms of serving the public. So, yeah, sometimes we would have to prioritise that. And again, the people that contact the police every day are looking for a service. It's how we manage and prioritise and respond in terms of the most appropriate manner.
Do you find that some officers find it more difficult than others to meet these expectations?
Perhaps, but again, it just comes down to the personalities, but also in terms of line management support as well. If they are, for instance, struggling, so if someone's workload is too great, are they getting? There is support measures there to assist them.
What about expectations insofar as we've looked at standards and the requirement and that they have to comply with the quality and diversity standards?
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel the expectations in that regard are too high?
They've obviously, I think, intensified, and that's only come through, I think, the knowledge and awareness of it. But again, I don't think that the kind of core responsibilities from when I first joined to now is any different, is that we will always be held to a higher standard. And I think from the position of responsibility and power that we do have as officers, is that's could be rightly expected by the public.
Can you see a way that some of these responsibilities could be relieved or eased for individual officers?
Is it in terms of now?
Yes.
Or yeah, I just think, as I say, the landscape in terms of demand of policing has changed in terms of what threats that we pose, in terms of even in terms of vulnerability. So again, I think it is just through discussion with colleagues in terms of the nature and demand that they're attending to, and how potentially they feel that is diverting them away from the real, I'm not saying the real policing, but in terms of the policing effectively. I think the nature of policing has changed. And again, even what I'm looking in terms of policing in a digital world, that the threat is from physical threats, there's now the digital threat online, and how we then respond and react to that as a service.
And when you talk about sort of real policing,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think, what does that mean?
Well, again, so as I said, the demand always outweighs the resource, and it's how we prioritise and focus where the resource requires to be of every minute of every day. I think in terms of vulnerability, it's not, these demands are not solely and can't sit with the police. Not saying to solve, but you've obviously got a partnership responsibility as well, especially in terms of vulnerability, in terms of health. So I know through speaking with officers, and I know even when I was an officer doing cell watch, for instance, I didn't particularly see that as my kind of core role when I was getting used for court duties. But again, it's a job that needed to get done, and you comply with it. A lot of officers now, I feel, that are sitting within health establishments, knowing that, well, why are they there? Is this the kind of core function of policing? Well, it is the reality of it. But can we look at potentially shifting that demand to other partners? And that won't be for me to decide. And again, the pressures of resource and finance, etc. So it definitely feels like a challenging time for policing. But again, that extends to society as well with other challenges.
Do you think that police officers view the standards of equality and diversity and observing those standards as not real policing?
No, because the standards then align ourselves to how we conduct ourselves. So I don't think, regardless of what the demand is and what the role we have to play, those core expectations and what's expected of us should transfer to what that job is.
Could we look at paragraph 30, please? You're talking there on the 3rd of May 2015. You do see what's playing out, and Alan, that's a reference to Alan Payton again, was first there. In terms of day shifts, the culture of the cops is they meet at 6 o'clock in the morning and they get told their duties. And unless there's an urgent call, the culture is canteen, coffee, watch the telly is the reality. And then the fact is, it's like toss a coin to whoever's going to get the first call. And then there would be the humping and hawing about. That's the view that doesn't get portrayed. The cops reacted to something. They didn't get their keys from the muster and head straight out to go patrol. There was a reactive response to the call as opposed to any of them driving about the streets. Can you explain what you mean by this paragraph?
Yeah, apologies. Poorly articulated. Again, I don't mean by culture, I was just trying to, and I think as that statement was a bit of scene setting, is the fact that with the timing of that call coincided with that shift just starting. Ordinarily, and again, just trying to work through a routine, is that the officers will attend and be briefed by the supervisor in terms of roles and responsibilities for that day, as opposed to where the demand then comes is dictated by whatever calls are received to the police. With the day shift, especially with a Sunday, once they've had that briefing, the routine and the culture would probably to go and get a cup of coffee, because they've been up early on the day shift. They would go and get a coffee, and they would pretty much lambast the controller for the first call they got, because it's causing them to go out onto the street.
And to Mr. Coffee.
Yeah. So, and again, that's important to officers. I think as part of that scene setting, is that if this call was to come in at any other time of the day during their shift, those officers would be effectively dispersed across Kirkcaldy dealing with whatever demand. So it was the fact that when the call came in, don't get me wrong, there was no tossing the coin to the side. They attended because of the circumstances as the entire team from the one place. So I suppose it did give the feel like en masse, as opposed to attending from different areas where the response might have been different in terms of the timing of arrival.
And were you making some comment there about Alan Payton in relation to him being first?
Yeah, and I think, I'm not sure what's above, but yeah, it was more the fact that I think he was the first, and we've spoke about my awareness of the call on the airwave. I think potentially he's the first voice that I heard familiar, as opposed to the controller.
We have heard that PC Payton and Walker were first to arrive.
I think I reckon, and again, I've explained my statement in terms of when I joined the police, Alan was on the shift I was on, so his voice was familiar.
So were you saying something about Alan Payton's attitude or demeanour that day, that, or was this an assumption that you were making?
Yeah, no, and I think again it's probably split. The fact when I was talking about Alan was hearing him on the radio, nothing about the routine of, I don't even know if he got a coffee that day. Some may go on, and some might have been in the writing room getting on with their workload and not chosen to do that. I was just saying they were all within the police station, having just been briefed. There was no other opportunity for them to be dispatched to another call.
Well, we have heard that PC Payton and Walker had actually gone out to another matter and then rerouted to go to Hayfield Road.
I wasn't aware of that.
No. All right. Thank you. Could we look at paragraph 31, please? And this is a part of your statement where you talk about race. I've read stories about Alan in the press. Again, you're referring to Alan Payton, but none of those issues, even in terms of family issues, were ever evident. He never spoke about it, to be honest, and again, I don't think there's an occasion that no doubt for all the stuff that I was involved with him, that I ever had any issues about his attitude or behaviour towards members of the public, or even views, perceptions, because I could easily quote many that did, to be honest, but Alan wasn't one of them. The fact is that he's been portrayed as a racist in the press by his family. Did I ever get a sense of that? Nah, never, to be honest. And was that your view of Alan Payton?
Yeah, and I think linked to, we also spoke about my terminology about the agendas yesterday. This was something that was playing out separately.
Right. And you talk about the stories that have appeared in the press about Alan Payton. Can I confirm with you, you had not observed any racist attitudes from former PC Payton in your experience of him? And you do talk about having been involved with him in all the stuff I was involved in. What does that mean? You see, no doubt for all the stuff that I was involved with him.
I think it is that first statement, that scene setting my knowledge of all the officers as part of Alan saying having joined, and he was part of the shift that I was on at the time, and I think I was on that shift for 2 years, to then probably sporadic involvement in years thereafter to on the day as I say, there was nothing, and again, I can't comment on private life, but there was nothing that, if there was issues in private life, that didn't transfer into any dealings that I had with him.
So you'd actually worked with him for a couple of years on the same shift?
Yeah.
Was that in Kirkcaldy?
That was Glenrothes in 1998.
All right. And so, can I confirm with you, had Alan Payton ever said anything in your presence that indicated that he held racist views or attitudes?
No.
Had you ever seen him do anything or treat anyone differently on the grounds of their race?
No.
When you then say, because I could easily quote many that did, to be honest, but Alan wasn't one of them. Tell us what you mean by that.
And that's not specifically to race. As I say, I have encountered people, as I say, who have acted or commented inappropriately. In terms of people I've worked with, I think I obviously explained that at the start, and people that I would align myself to in terms of good role models, as opposed to people that I would effectively avoid.
When you say they had acted inappropriately, can you give us some examples of what you're meaning?
I think it would be but as I say, their conduct within the workplace, they would, if it was something that extended in terms of any overt action or specific direct views to anybody, then I would like to think I would have had the confidence back then to challenge, or if not, notify. I think it was just more that Alan didn't seem. I had no issues or any experience with Alan. I think it would just say others, yes. Throughout my policing career, I've experienced that people have acted inappropriately, definitely.
So you've clearly explained that you've come across people in your time in the police service who you've not wished to align yourself with, and you've removed yourself from them. You've talked about these people acting inappropriately. I'm trying to work out in what way they've acted inappropriately.
Just going back more round about your comments or views they've shared, views that they hold, but again, not specific to racism. Again, for all of the kind of protected characteristics under the Equality Act.
Right. So, in relation to any comments about racism, you say you've not seen that. But what about discriminatory comments?
Definitely.
What type of protected characteristics are you talking about?
From my own experience, age, in terms of joining at 17, and again the views of maybe the older generation.
Oh, these were directed at you. Anything else?
Probably, and again, just on reflection, having my recent involvement with the force's efforts in terms of tackling sex and misogyny would be misogynistic. I mean, comments to female colleagues particularly.
What about religion?
I can't say, but if you were to associate religion with potential football or that, perhaps.
Sectarianism.
Yeah.
You've seen that exhibited over the years.
Yeah, and again, just within the workplace, talking about the football and then religion, sectarianism playing out in terms of comments, and I mean sometimes the terms used for certain teams and
By officers.
Yeah, who again supporting fractions in terms of there had been a game and just so.
Any other protected characteristics?
I would probably include them all. In fairness, at some point, there's not. I can't be specific.
When you say you'd probably include them all, would you include racism, race?
But I think we talked about with jokes with racial connotations, slurs, stereotypes. Yeah.
You've mentioned, I think, in another paragraph about old-fashioned jokes about the Englishman, the Scot, and the Irishman. Is that the type of thing you're thinking about?
Yeah, and more specific jokes round about other religions and race.
And would that relate to black men?
Yes.
Muslims?
Perhaps, yeah.
Perhaps you can't remember, or probably, but you can't specifically remember
Again,
anything
I think
today.
if we can relate with not so much with WhatsApp because it was different. Jokes that used to be cascade sent amongst contacts that would involve, as I say, various ethnicities, as I say, sexist, misogynistic.
Thinking back now, did you challenge those comments?
No, certainly not in my early years. Again, as I tried to get to grips with an organisation in terms of 17 years old, and those, again, probably not until maybe I was in kind of supervisory ranks. Again, probably the kind of awareness raising around it, and I certainly wasn't going to adopt some of the practices, and that's even in terms of people's work ethic. In terms of, as I say, I took what I thought in my eyes were the good and the bad of the people that I worked with to try and, as I evolved and developed as an officer.
And you've mentioned some of the possible reasons why someone may not challenge that type of behaviour. What were your reasons for not feeling able to challenge that behaviour?
Again, trying to say, have I been in a canteen where something's been said inappropriate? Have I reacted and laughed, trying to think it was the right thing to do within the team? Would have thought at that time that it was potentially wrong? Yeah. Would have challenged? No. Again, that fear of wanting to be the kind of team player. I don't think there was ever a point I thought I need to challenge this, but if I did, would I be fear of being kind of ostracised from the shift effectively? Again, just my age, the potential immaturity, and the kind of steep learning curve of joining an organisation like the police.
And why would you find that you laughed at things like that?
Again, and it by no means like peer pressure, but as I said, I'm not saying I did laugh, but again, I suppose it comes down to back then, what did be classed as humour? Did I think that there was any ill will or intention because of the joke or sense of humour? And again, it changed dramatically since, but I think in policing there was the dark humour element of some of the roles and jobs that we did do aren't nice, continue not to be nice, so do we try to lighten the mood by introducing humour to help ourselves in terms of dealing with it? Would that have been deemed inappropriate to others? And I think, by no means knowing your audience, but you know the people you work with, that wasn't being complacent to go back and voice whatever opinions I can. It was just that it was the environment at that time.
Would that include comments that now you look back could be considered racist comments?
I definitely now, but not directed at an individual specific person. Potentially a group, yeah, but a group that then potentially wouldn't be part of the conversation either. So it was within that environment everybody saw it as humour. If I thought there was any, as I say, intent or some form of specific view that might reflect on how they did the job, then I would like to think I would have an issue with that.
And you mentioned the words about being a team player, and you've mentioned peer pressure. Can you explain a little about the impact that had on you?
So again, I think as you want to go into an organisation first and foremost, a new team, again the mixed characters, personalities within that, you want to kind of endear yourself to them as part of fitting in, I suppose. As part of that, I would see kind of, as I say, with me being subject, I don't feel kind of victimised, but that, what would it be classed as then? Like kind of character building in terms of, and I didn't have really good, I had mixed dealings with the police before I joined. When I joined at 17 as a cadet, did I think that I could maybe make a difference and bridge that gap with the youth, given how they were potentially perceived? Yes. Did I have some success with that? Yeah, and from a local level. But I was obviously I was never going to solve any other holistical, broader, deep-rooted issues. So yeah, I think I potentially may have went along with stuff that was said in a open environment, nothing specific. I'm saying to me, but it would generally be in that kind of team environment, because again, the reality is the time that you did have to meet and discuss was in the canteen, and I don't want to try and portray like the canteen culture, but that's the times that you were to only time really in the day you were together, given the demands of the job.
And we've heard evidence about different ranks and the quite hierarchical nature of the police. Has that also had an impact on when you felt able to react or challenge behaviour?
Yeah, and I think as even your first line manager, supervisor training, you try to provide, you obviously want to have a close association with your officers, but you definitely have to have a line. And again, usually that includes potentially not being in the canteen where they can relax and be themselves. Not to say that there's anything inappropriate going on, but I definitely felt as my first role as a supervisor that, you know what I mean, you were kind of being ostracised because we're a team and we want to have a laugh, and the supervisor may obviously interfere or disrupt that.
A few minutes ago you talked about jokes used to be cascade. You used the word cascade and sent amongst contacts. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, again, not having a phone in the 90s that had the technology it's got now, it would be if it's the analogue or whatever text, and you would receive them in more in the kind of narrative, nothing fancy, so it's just a normal standard text message.
And nowadays, obviously we have memes and photographs and videos that can be communicated. Do they continue to cascade messages, officers amongst themselves?
Again, we've talked about, and we know that WhatsApp groups do exist between groups and associations of people. Again, that's not explicit to policing, so potentially yes, and I've explained my position on that, and that I'll soon, if I'm part of a group that I don't agree with, potentially come out and not challenge, and that's because it's not just solely to policing. And again, if it's associates or whatever, they're not held obviously in the same standards or the expectations of standards as we are.
As police officers are.
But to be honest, I think from the friends that I do have now, there's probably a kind of respect that they won't share stuff with me because they know my position on it.
Because of your rank, do you think, or your
No,
presence as an officer?
and the police, and they know where I stand on these issues.
So do you feel now you do have the maturity and the confidence to stand up for?
I just don't get sent anything.
Does that make it easier for you?
Yeah, and it's not, again, the ignorance, the fact that I'm alive to the fact that it will go on elsewhere probably.
Can we look at paragraph 32, please? I have been asked if I ever got a sense of that in the police force generally, among the rank and file, the canteen or elsewhere. Nah, never. My day business is now dealing with this in the wake of Sarah Everard, so we do a thing about sex equality and tackling misogyny, and I can definitely reflect about inappropriate behaviour and comments. Again, we'll always have that debate of was it banter? Regardless, the reflection is that it only takes one person to not agree with it and it's wrong. I think that's just how society's changed, that acceptance. So I would never, as I say, mainly because I have childhood friends in terms of Asian and African, I would never stand for it because that has never been acceptable. Now, it's not a thing. In terms of inappropriate jokes and the rest of it, yeah, but not somebody out and out racist. I'd like to ask you some questions about this paragraph. If we can go back to the top, please. You mention, well, first of all, maybe just, I think when you signed this statement, you were dealing with something regarding Sarah Everard and misogyny. But is that the same as the work you're doing on digital?
No, it's in my previous role.
So this was your previous role, and you've moved on since then. Thank you. You've used the word banter, inappropriate behaviour and comments, and do you you use the word then a debate about whether it was banter? What does that mean to you?
Again, the term has been about for as long as communication between probably people that are familiar with themselves, so friends, where you may insult them, they may insult you back, but you've got that respect that it's not personal and seen as humour between parties.
And you'll understand that one man's banter could be another man's deeply offensive comment.
Yes.
We've heard some information in the media generally within the past week about banter and a WhatsApp group in relation to Met officers down south being treated very seriously down there. And I think it said on the news last week that 2 officers were going through misconduct proceedings that had been brought by the Chief Constable of the Met to see if they could get them dismissed from the force. Would you agree now that banter now should not be dismissed and ignored?
Oh, definitely not. And again, just reflect on the interactions I will have with people in everyday life.
Do you think banter was ignored or dismissed previously?
I think just in line with the same thing about humour and jokes, the fact that the view was that it was acceptable because of the humour element, but not probably appreciating the impact.
So from your experience in the Professional Standards Department, do you accept that banter does require to be addressed?
Yeah.
Do you think the word banter is maybe diminishes the significance of some of these comments, inappropriate comments that can be made?
Yeah, it tries to normalise, and it tries, by using that, it seems it's okay, which it's not.
And that maybe using that word dismisses or minimises the concerns of someone who has been offended. You say at the end of that paragraph, in terms of inappropriate jokes and the rest of it, yeah, but not somebody out and out racist. What distinction are you drawing there?
Again, if someone was to make a joke and if it had anything to do with race, religion and the other elements, I mean, and if it was conveyed to try and be humour, whether it was appropriate or not, I don't think and again, a colleague that I've sat expressed their own personal views on a particular, as I say, in terms of race, any form of ill will, or as I say, that I think that they would go out and that would transfer on how they delivered the service to that particular race, religion. I don't think I think this about that race. It was never personal. I mean, it was more generalised, I think, in terms of the jokes, the comments, as opposed to someone expressing that real hate of a particular class.
How would you define an out-and-out racist?
I can't. It was just to distinguish between if someone thinks they're being humorous and the fact that it's inappropriate, that's one thing. For somebody then to express specific views about anybody is taking it stage in terms of that intent, that premeditation of how they feel, driven by it, whatever their motives are.
And who would decide whether what's said is a joke or what's said is racist?
Yeah, I think that comes down to it would come down to the individual. I suppose someone's intention of what they think is a joke, and if they're to be addressed that that's unacceptable, and they then learn from that, I suppose that's one way of educating. But again, if it's someone in terms of an overt action or comment or some form of view, then that's the distinction I would make.
Would it be the person observing that would form that view?
Well, as I know, in terms of any kind of hate crime, it doesn't have to be between 2 people. It could be a bystander as well.
So would it be one individual observing or a group of individuals observing that would be the people who would decide?
Depend on the circumstances, if it's a group environment, or depend on the makeup of the audience.
So it would be them that would decide, is this racist or a joke?
It would have to be either, yeah, because obviously if it wasn't the person that's the source of it, seems to be, I'm not saying oblivious, but I suppose they're taken out of the equation. It's how it's perceived by others.
And then you'll see just at the start of paragraph 33, you say, I have been asked if I mean inappropriate racist jokes, and you say aye. You can reflect on it in terms of text jokes and all the rest of it, jokes about nationalities, Englishman, Irishman, Scot. I don't think that's specific to the police. And I know we're looking at different landscape in terms of institutional racism and maybe other police forces. Communities are different as well. That's changed now in terms of diverse communities that are predominantly policed by white Europeans. We then have integrated other cultures and communities into Fife predominantly, because I've never really worked anywhere else community-based. I want to ask you a few questions about this paragraph. You're asked about inappropriate racist jokes and you said yes. So you've heard inappropriate racist jokes.
And again, extending to the other protected characteristics, yeah.
Effectively all the protected characteristics.
Yeah, it wasn't specific just to race.
From police officers.
Yeah.
And you talk about text jokes and all the rest of it, jokes about nationalities. What do you mean by that?
I think that was going back to the cascade, a time in whatever period that you would see a thread of different themed text effectively that would be sent to people's contacts.
And you say, I know we're looking at different landscape in terms of institutional racism and maybe other police forces. Can I ask, first of all, you use the term institutional racism.
Yeah.
What is it you mean you introducing that term?
No, I just think now that the landscape that as an organisation we are accepting that, I mean, racism exists within policing, and again that's how we respond to that as part of becoming our ambition to be a anti-racist organisation.
And then you mentioned other police forces.
I just think it's not specific to Police Scotland. It's policing across the UK, potentially worldwide.
Right. And you talk about the communities changing and are now more diverse, predominantly policed by white Europeans. Can you tell me a little bit more about this?
I think probably the context with that was whether it was earlier in the statement or a previous one. I think again is trying to set the scene of Kirkcaldy, or even indeed Fife back then. I think I was asked in terms of my awareness of black community, and I was trying to say that I wasn't aware that it was a particularly big community. I then tried to say that, well, the Eastern European community, in terms of that appeared to be a bigger presence to me at that time as opposed to the black community. And again, policed by predominantly white officers, but again I know the landscape in terms of how our kind of profile around recruitment has changed as well.
And you say, I've never really worked anywhere else community-based. So where is the majority of your community-based work?
So I would class that as Fife. Up until 2015 I'd worked predominantly in Fife. I think it explained it's a small compact region and community.
Could we look at paragraph 34, please? My knowledge of racial diversity in Fife is my experience through the crimes that we dealt with. Early doors in my career, early 2000s, was a major increase in Eastern Europeans, predominantly Polish. That was through industry as well. They predominantly worked on farms and cattle produce, agricultural industry. And the reason we knew that is the fact that they actually like to drink and like to fight with each other. Can I ask you, what impact are you suggesting the increase in Eastern European people in Fife has had on the crimes that you and your officers had to deal with?
Yeah. First and foremost, and I'm going to reflect on that, I don't like how the last sentence I've effectively stereotyped in terms of that all Eastern Europeans drink and fight with each other, so I reflect on that. I think it was more...
I was going to ask you about that in a moment. Looking at that sentence now,
I think
you'll appreciate that does appear
No, totally.
to be a racial stereotype.
I totally understand that.
And that paragraph does appear to be very derogatory.
I apologise for any harm that's caused.
Well, let's stick with this paragraph for the moment. The question I'd asked was, what impact were you suggesting or describing there that the increase in Eastern European people in Fife had had on the crimes that you were dealing with when you've worked there?
So this was, again, trying to articulate it better than I have there. It was more about my dealings with people from diverse communities. And the fact is that I did attend incidents where Eastern Europeans had been fighting with each other. And so that's the fact as opposed to generalising. And as we engaged with them, that allowed me to get a greater understanding of their background. There was an initial distrust in the police, and it was explained to me that that had derived from their background in Eastern Europe, or if it was specific to Poland at that time. So again, it was an understanding of, we go as a police to respond to an incident to assist them best we can and to receive resistance, but to understand that that was derived through their experiences and background. So that raised awareness, and as a consideration for me to tailor potentially, and I think I spoke about those reasonable adjustments the next time, or how could we actually, for what is a potentially hard to reach community, how could we improve those relationships as part of a new and emerging diverse community?
So you've talked about you had dealt with cases or investigations where Eastern Europeans had fought with each other. No doubt you've dealt with cases where white people from Fife have fought
Definitely.
with each other. Would you suggest that all white people in the Fife region like to fight with each other?
So again, potentially the wrong example to give. So if I was to have my time now, my engagement with the Polish community, I understood there was barriers to overcome in terms of their distrust in the police owing to their previous experiences.
As part of the mistrust that the community may have, could that arise partly from a perception, perhaps, that officers think they all like to drink and fight with each other?
I'd hope not. And again, that's as part of the question and answer format that the inquiry statement took. I was just trying to give an example and introduce my first dealings with diverse communities, and that again how we needed, not one size fits all, and how we needed to tailor our service to them to increase that public trust and confidence from their previous experience.
In terms of Eastern Europeans and Polish people, from your experience of working in that community, did they have a negative view about how they were perceived by police officers?
Not that I'm aware of.
Do you know why that distrust or mistrust had arisen in relation to the police?
So again, and as I've got a lot of colleagues that are from Eastern Europe in terms of police officers, they've provided that context in terms of the different approach in terms of Eastern Europe of police. I think subject in terms of physical violence. It's just that it appeared to be a different policing approach, different culture.
And when you're talking about a different approach, who would take that approach? Who are you talking about?
No, in terms of the policing in Eastern Europe was different from policing in specifically Fife.
So they had perhaps negative experiences
from their lived
Poland.
experience, yes, and that has come with them, and obviously seeing then the police in Scotland, they have concerns, fears as a result of that, so that there was barriers to overcome.
And you think their concerns that were that the police in Poland were more physically violent than Scottish police.
Potentially, yeah.
And is that in itself perhaps a generalisation and a stereotype?
No, I think it was from speaking to our colleagues from Eastern Europe in terms of there's a different policing style and their lived experience. So I'm not saying that every Eastern European has been assaulted by the police. That's not. It's they've had a different experience to policing in Poland to the UK.
And presumably not every police officer in Poland engages in physical violence.
No, so.
I'm conscious of the time.
Point, we'll take a 20-minute break. Yes, Miss Graham.
Thank you. Could we turn to paragraph 35 of your inquiry statement, please? And this says that was really about the first dealings with the police. Were they accepted? Are they accepted? Yeah, I think where they come about is through private housing as well. You did get like pockets, new build estates that were bought carte blanche by investors, let out. So you did have pockets of Eastern European communities. That also crept into recruitment in the police as well. So we had actually a really great relationship because we had a couple of good Polish officers at Kirkcaldy at that time as well, which again, you need to know the landscape of where they've come from in terms of that potential distrust in the police, because where they've come from, potentially corruption and all the rest of it. Let's look at this paragraph. I'm particularly interested in your comment that also crept into recruitment in the police as well. Do you see that in the middle of the paragraph?
It was just more as the profile of the community changed, so did the profile of recruits into the police from all different backgrounds.
So as people from Eastern Europe or from Poland arrived in Scotland, some of them came into the police service.
Yes.
Can I ask you about the word crept? Crept sounds, if I may say, quite a negative word.
It wasn't immediately apparent. It was a transition, effectively, as depending on obviously when people arrived and attempted to seek employment in general. It wasn't like a mass recruitment drive times targeted at Eastern Europeans. It was just as time went on, slowly you started to see the profile of our organisation change. So again, if it's the wrong choice of words, I apologise, but it was a slow process, and it built on it. I think that was just it grew as it went along. Sorry.
So it started small and grew over time. And now do you have far more Polish officers and Eastern European officers in the police service?
Yes, I don't know the number, but yes.
And again, we see at the end of that paragraph that there's a comment where you talk again about potential distrust in the police because where they've come from, potentially corruption and all the rest of it. What did you mean by that?
Again, it's just potentially one of the factors that may lead to us building that relationship with them. From the lived experience come from Eastern Europe.
Again, would you accept that that's a generalisation?
Yeah, I was just trying to give some context, nothing factual. It was just potentially a factor.
Right. So not based on any actual knowledge that you personally had, but a generalisation of the possible
and
corruption.
also something that I've maybe been informed by my colleagues that have lived there.
Polish colleagues?
Yes.
About their own specific experience?
Yes.
And did you find that the comments they made about their own specific experience in Poland influenced your attitudes and views of corruption in Poland?
It didn't influence me, it just gave me a better understanding and awareness, again, how to try and tailor any approach that I had going forward and considerations.
And how did you use that information or that knowledge to tailor your own actions?
Again, just awareness raising that I know if I was to obviously come into contact with somebody from Eastern Europe that I may have a challenge around building that rapport and that early contact, or if I know that I potentially got conflict or resistance from the outset, that maybe not to take that personally because there was potential reasons behind that. And again, that applies to all members of the public in terms of their first, in my dealings with them. You don't know what background or lived experience they come from, and not to take it personally, the fact that if they don't respond in the manner which I would, I'm not saying expect, but a normal response.
We talked about the comments that you'd made about Eastern Europeans and Polish people before the break. In relation to if a situation arose when you were at work on duty and comments were made by an officer, such as the ones that appeared in your statement, would that cause you to challenge what they'd said?
Again, I think with that is and again where I've made the mistake in trying to set the scene and make that statement, and as I say, definitely in terms of this stereotyping would be the kind of unconscious element of it. So I might not pick up on the fact that unless it was direct, and again I've been educated since in terms of the kind of unconscious bias element of our behaviours.
So you've had additional training since your first statement. This is your first statement.
Yes.
You've had additional training with the police since that day.
An awareness, yeah.
Yeah.
And in fairness, before that as well, but it's...
We'll come on to that training in a moment. Have you found that your recent training has assisted you in recognising comments which might be derogatory or discriminatory?
The training and probably more importantly my time in PSD, just given that's what I was basically dealing on a daily basis, that wider awareness of issues across the force, and again just a greater understanding of how things can be perceived, so it was definitely a learning aspect for me.
You'd been in PS police standards for a couple of years, and that was before you wrote your first statement in March 2022.
Yeah.
So to what extent did you find your time in police standards actually helped you understand any biases which you yourself experienced?
Sorry, not particularly biases, it was more just about the wider issues and that how people's actions and behaviours could be construed that maybe weren't completely obvious to me, but again that would depend on the circumstances.
And to what extent has your recent training assisted you in recognising unconscious bias?
Yeah, I think it causes you to hold up a mirror to yourself in terms of how you conduct yourself, not just within policing, but in how I go about daily business in life, and again how the wider responsibilities with parenting, etc. as well, is what I learn is to try and pass that on to the people that I can influence.
Were you, as part of that training in unconscious bias, asked to reflect on whether you had any biases? You've talked about holding a mirror to yourself.
I think with that and other elements of training, you're asked to do that first. Again, it takes that bit of, I'm not saying confidence, but you need to really, if you're going to learn anything from it, is look at yourself and question yourself and test yourself in terms of, is this something that you can relate to? And if you can, more importantly, what can you do to, I'm not saying prevent it, but consider your actions on a daily basis?
And have you held that mirror up to yourself?
Yeah, not just one conscious bias for all things, and I think I'd said to you my involvement with the kind of sexism and misogyny work that I was involved in.
And focusing on the biases, were you able to identify in yourself through that process biases that you yourself held?
Yeah, and I think previously, and again, I don't like to think. I would like to try and draw a difference between what I committed to paper, trying to set the scene, as opposed to my assumptions of that particular. That was just purely articulated, as opposed to the views that I hold. I was trying to explain the circumstances in answer to the questions from the inquiry.
And before the break, you didn't. You looked at the paragraph and reflected on that, and you've given your evidence on that. Can I ask you about unconscious bias? I've asked a lot of officers about unconscious bias. And to summarise, there's been very little evidence given about training about that. So I'm interested in your own experience of assessing your own unconscious bias. Could you help the chair understand the process you went through in trying to identify your own unconscious bias?
As opposed to the training and awareness I was given? Or
Well, if you did it separately, tell us about that
yeah,
first
and I
of
think,
all.
to be honest, yeah.
If it was part of the training, tell us about
Yeah,
that.
it came about through and again, my time in PSD coincided with the certainly initial publication of the Dame Angeline report in terms of complaint handling, and unconscious bias features as part of that. I think for us to better understand the associated recommendations, we were given an input on that. So again, how we were then to go to cascade or potentially understand how we can raise awareness around that. So yeah, and I say we were given the way I find to learn is give tangible examples. So these were realistic examples from workplaces, not specifically policing, and that I could definitely relate to some of them. Again, making them about associated to comments as well sometimes.
Can you remember any and talk us through what you were taught, or?
The examples?
Yeah, can you remember?
No,
any?
but I think I recall that there's three elements to unconscious bias. Again, with the overarching one of you appear from your own back. Everybody's opinions are drawn from potential preconceived or from your own upbringing and experiences, and how you then draw on your own perceptions and views. And with that, you might then treat people you consider as similar in a different way to then someone that's potentially different from you. So it was understanding from the lived experiences from survivors of that, effectively, the impact that had on that. So it was given the tangible examples, but more importantly, which I could relate to, but the biggest impact factor was the references from people to how that had impacted on their lives.
And that assisted you in understanding the impact of unconscious bias, did it?
Yeah, as opposed to just being front-facing and talking through the principles of it, I definitely learn better and understand through the kind of tangible examples to this, and then more importantly, the kind of relevance and the credibility of someone's having experienced it and been victim of it.
And was part of that meeting people who had been the victim of unconscious bias?
Yeah, it was, if I recall, it was in person in terms of PSD personnel, and I think potentially I formed a presentation as part of that. There was either statements from people, or if I can't recall, if it was messaging or videoing from people telling you about their experience and how, having been subject to it, how it made them feel, how it impacted on their lives.
And you talked about treating them in a different way because of unconscious bias. You talked about people who look like you or are like you, treating them in a different way. What did you mean, a different way?
So that was the principles is that you, and again, whether there's the academia around it, to say people that you think are like you will treat in a more favourable way. Again, I don't think if I can. Again, if I do that, I do it without thinking. I suppose that's the whole concept, unconscious bias. But I could definitely relate to the kind of tangible examples that were given. And
the flip side of that coin will be that if they don't look like you, you would treat them in a less favourable way.
Potentially.
Right. And so in relation to unconscious bias, were you able to, when you held that mirror up to yourself, were you able to recognise that you had some unconscious bias?
Had or had, in terms of probably going back to my infancy, because I like to think it's not, you're only talking 2 years ago, so I would like to think I was the general awareness through equality and diversity that, again, the importance of not treating people the same because everybody's different, but treating people in order of their needs, beliefs, and all the elements of that, in terms of that bespoke service in terms of policing with the public.
And was that training that you'd originally had when you came into the service?
In terms of quality diversity?
Yes.
No, I think it was part of when I think it was initially got it in Fife Constabulary.
When you got into Fife?
Yeah, but I don't think any formal training perhaps took place until, I think it was potentially 2007, 2008. It's on the scope record.
You have a hard copy of your rank postings and training record. If you look at page 5, this lists, as I understand it, we've been provided with a copy of this week. It's not yet going to be on the screen, but if you can see page 5, that there was an Equality and Diversity Awareness course in April of 2007 that you attended, and then in September of 2008. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Do you remember anything about either of those courses?
Don't recall the second one.
The disability
in terms of
awareness.
differentiating, but I knew that I'm not sure if the disability one would have been potentially online, but definitely the first one because it took place over a number of days in person at our the headquarters of Fife Constabulary in Glenorthas.
How did that help you?
Again, I think that the title bit awareness, and as part of that, there was the I'm saying legislation, but there was the kind of narrative and theory around elements of it. But to bolster that and kind of bring it home, there was also presentations from people from different backgrounds.
So did you find that particular course helped raise your awareness of issues regarding diversity and equality?
Definitely, because you were hearing it firsthand, how people had potentially been, that lived experience of people living in our communities, to how they had been potentially mistreated or treated differently. So again,
to what did that have more of an impact than an online course or a written course?
100%. Again, because you were, and I've had training with the fact is it's delivering the topic, but potentially not with the expertise. And I think you'll learn better from hearing from the people that it directly relates to.
So, if any training you've had over the years, how would you rate that particular training course?
That was
Diversity.
very good because it was the first of its kind. So we're used to training in terms of for our roles and responsibilities specific to whatever your role or department you are. So that's to give you the skills to do that particular role. This was different because it didn't just it applied to the whole of the organisation at that time, and it wasn't, I'm not saying groundbreaking, but as I say, it was the first course bespoke to equality and diversity. So that's what made it stand out effectively.
Was that a compulsory course for you?
I would imagine so. I didn't know if there would be an option to opt out, but again, it's something that I wouldn't in any case.
Have you had a course like that since?
Potentially not with it's kind of badged as equality and diversity, but I've attended a number of training courses and inputs where the equality and diversity theme or even ECHR would be a thread or consideration as part of that.
We've heard that sometimes there's mention of things like diversity and race or human rights, as you're saying, in other courses, but the focus with other courses may be separate from diversity.
Yes, the main topic, yeah.
You've also mentioned completing another equality and diversity course. I think it's probably the final entry in your training records, 3rd of January 2023. Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, e-learning. Is that an online course?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So again, you're because it's online, you get the notification. I think it's obviously a directive from the force that every employee was to undertake that training. So you're sent no notification to undertake it there's a timescale associated with that. It's up for line management to manage and afford staff the time to do it, and it's kind of modular. I know that encapsulated a lot of elements, and that you would work through it. Again, it was online, but a mixture of theory plus, again, with technology now supported by potential videos. It was quite, I'm saying interactive, but it was visual as opposed to just a narrative. And at various times there would be a kind of knowledge test based on that particular element, that there had to be a pass rate effectively before you moved on. And I can't recall, maybe 3 or 4 sections to that. It would obviously indicate you've successfully completed it, and that would naturally be added to your training courses, having undertaken that e-learning.
We've heard some evidence that there's now a compulsory course, and I think someone called it a Moodle course.
So that's that.
Is that the
Yeah,
same thing?
sorry.
And is that all officers in Police Scotland will have to complete that
Yes.
course?
Staff, so
Oh, sorry.
officers and members of police staff, as I would understand, the whole of the organisation.
You've talked about it having theory and video and being interactive. How did that course compare to the 2007 course, which you've obviously found
Yeah.
to be of assistance?
It supplemented my existing knowledge. I think if that had been the first course in terms of a new concept, I don't think it would have the same impact. So I've obviously benefited from the in-person and how obviously equality and diversity has evolved over the years, my involvement in PSD. So personally for me, I found it very informative. Obviously it included any recent developments in terms of equality and diversity. Does it replace the in-person one? I'm not too sure. I think and you're also able to move through it at your own pace as well. I don't think you have to start it and complete it on that day. So again, and I think we've talked about the challenge of demand, is affording yourself the time when on duty to do this. It may be a challenge for others in terms of trying to capture the number of people in the organisation.
Can I ask you about paragraph 16 of your inquiry statement? It relates to training. Sorry, it will be the second inquiry statement, which I think is 225, if I remember. 251, that's it. Thank you. Sorry. Paragraph 16. You've been asked about training. And you say, I don't know if there was a knowledge check to assess our awareness. I remember there was a shock and awe element. I think the thread of all of it that I've always maintained is to consider everybody and be respectful of everyone's beliefs. In terms of society, we've been on a journey to where we are now. We need to be aware of how our actions can be perceived and be considerate and respectful of all, regardless of what their beliefs are. Are you referring here to the 2007 course that you were talking about?
Yes.
And what was the shock and awe element of that course?
Again, I think certainly for me that was the first time you had members of your community coming in to tell them, regardless, and again I was quite, my view is that the police delivers a good service. To be told that's not how it's perceived by others is a kind of wake-up call. You think you can provide a good service, but again, for the public was served telling us different, it was the kind of the wake-up call for me.
And having had that wake-up call, what impact did that have on your policing and the job you were doing?
Again, I think it treated us definitely not to be complacent. And again, I suppose how we evaluated our service to the public. And I think the way that you do that is, and again, I think what was drawn out of there is by engaging with them. I mean, I think we did with the service and we walked away without suppose that kind of customer service of, well, how did we do? It exists in private organisation. Did our service meet your expectations? And the mechanisms that how we would get that form of feedback, because I think feedback from externally certainly has more probably credibility and accuracy and weight than us trying to review our own actions and how we learn and move on from that.
Do you have any suggestions for the Chair about how the police service could improve that level of engagement between the police and members of the community and the public?
I think my view to what we have in place now, I think is obviously significantly different in terms of what Police Scotland's put in place in terms of so predominantly with my background, with victims of crime, we have advocacy groups, we've got close working relationships, we will engage with them. They will provide feedback in terms of various elements of survivors in terms of the response actions of the police, and again leading from the call, and if it's obviously like criminal justice outcomes straight through to prosecution, and that kind of holistic service to victims. You've
talked about groups. I was going to come onto this later, but I'd like to ask you now. You mention in your statement a sex equality and tackling misogyny working group. It's paragraph 26, I think. Now, this obviously relates to sexism and misogyny, but I'm interested in the group itself. Why was this group set up? Undoubtedly in the wake of the Sarah Everard incident down south. When was it set up? I think it would be the start of 2022, perhaps. Who's on the group? Is it all officers, or do you have laypersons? So it's led by a member of the force executive at DCC level, who was embarked on leading the group. It consists of senior management. It consists of staff associations. So it's an internal. It commenced as an internal group. Staff associations and the various staff associations that were there. Also, different corporate functions within the organisation in terms of strategy, innovation, stakeholder engagement. I think potentially the Scottish Police Authority. So it started relatively small to ensure obviously they got the terms of reference and purpose of the group, and I think it's obviously expanded since then. I've not been involved in recent months since I moved to my new role. And what, from your recollection, was the aim of this group? I think from the outset was to recognise that sexism and misogyny existed within Police Scotland, as opposed to a group set up sometimes, a working group to try and establish if an issue exists. So right from the outset, these issues existed within Police Scotland. Our communities told us that, our staff told us that, and the lived experience told that from various incidents, and it's how we would respond as an organisation in terms of tackling that. And who was the chair of that group? It was DCC Graham. And was there a similar group set up in relation to race? I understand. Or is there a similar group? I understand there's an EDI, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion group. Who chairs that? I think it's DCC Taylor. Sorry, it is DCC Taylor. Right. And how long has that group been in existence? That's existed for a number of years, is my understanding. And how is the success or failure of these groups measured? I think in terms of internally and I think it was part of the kind of healthy discussions and challenges at the outset of the meeting, is for, especially from staff associations, to, I think, insights, surveys, lived experience told us of the issue. I think, like anything, when we try to consult on it with our staff for a multitude of matters, there's sometimes that kind of resistance
to engage with it, because probably the perception is, well, we've told you all this before and nothing changes. So again, I think that was one of the first challenges, was to demonstrate and how you build that trust and confidence of the best way you can show you've listened is because you've got something tangible in terms of outcome and change. And I think it was definitely going to take, or is taking time to build up that trust and confidence with our organisation, to show and demonstrate that as a result of tackling this, changes will be made. Whether that's obviously procedural guidance, I'm unsure.
And how is do you know much about the race group?
No, I don't.
No. Do you know how it's made up, or the
Again,
members?
so I think like the majority groups, there would be obviously your internal strategic group effectively, but again, I think as part of that checks and balances in terms of measuring its progress, is that no doubt there's that peer review, like a reference group. So I think of both, there's a professional reference group of various, made up of various partners, in terms of updating them on, again, because it's not proclaiming that we know how to tackle this or we've got all the answers. So again, it is about consultation and partnership working.
And do you know what the aims of that group are?
In terms of the EDI, sorry, I don't know.
No.
Apart from the obvious in terms of
Yeah.
the equality and diversity.
And what work do they do? What you've talked about changes. What changes have they implemented? Do you know?
So again, I appreciate it's still in its infancy, and I think
The race group. Do you know?
I've had no involvement with that.
You don't know.
No.
Do they have a very visible, the race group, do they have a visible presence within the police service?
Yeah, so, and again, I think trying to bring the sex equality, tackle misogyny and the EDI, trying to bring it under, and all the various other elements under one banner, so that's what I think I'd refer to in terms of policing together. So that's been widely publicised on our intranet, I think potentially publicly as well, and again with the kind of mission statement of the ambition of the chief with regards to making our service an anti-racist organisation, along with anti-discrimination as well, and tackling sex equality, tackling misogyny, also discrimination as well.
How effective do you think the publicising of these groups has been on the intranet? Because we have heard some evidence that officers don't always have time to access things on that.
So yeah, and I could appreciate that. There's, depending on the role that you undertake in terms of your, more so from if you're office based and actually your use of a computer on a regular basis, you will have access to the intranet. I appreciate potentially response colleagues, but there might be limited access or opportunity. But again, there's line management briefings as well. So again, when you can't capture the large number of officers we're looking to direct or the messaging, there's line managers toolkits, and I think you'd obviously talked about the kind of product or change as part of the EDI group. I'm surmising that EDI training that I've just undertaken would have been part of the group in the coordination.
So they may have had a role in instigating that new e-learning course that you've done?
Yes, that makes sense. That would, as that kind of strategic oversight group, that would have been either initially action from there, actually to be undertaken perhaps by different departments within the organisation.
Thank you. Now, you said in I think your first statement, I don't need to take you to it, you'd said at that stage you'd not done any bespoke courses on diversity alone, but having had the opportunity to look at your training records, you seem to now remember attending the 2007 course.
Yeah, and in fairness, I had access to that's taken from my kind of personnel record on the computer, that I did have access to that when providing the statement.
And you've now undertaken this year the e-learning course.
Yes.
So the position in relation to training, does that change on a semi-regular basis?
Yeah.
Can we look at paragraph 20 of your I don't have a note, sorry. I'm not sure if it's this statement or another one. It is this. That's lucky. You say at paragraph 20, and this is 251, your second inquiry statement. For my terrorist detention training, ethnicity and religion had to be a consideration. This was fairly simple, a 2-day course. It was and remains at the Scottish Terrorist Detention Centre in Govan in Strathclyde. It was to increase the cadre so that it didn't always fall to Strathclyde officers owing to the location. There was input and background about terrorism, about ideology, depending on the ethnicity of people coming in, faith, religion, what's fair, etc. This is fairly common in custody procedure. It does feature in normal custody training. It wasn't learning, it was awareness raising. It was educational process, but also on the wider considerations. Can you tell us a little bit more about this training you've had? We've not discussed this before.
Yeah, I think it was trying to, by no means bridging the gap, but it does certainly look on paper between 2007 for equality and diversity training to then effectively this year, that to give that perception that we've been void of any kind of inputs in terms of equality and diversity. I was given an example of the other, with the record in front of me, and examples of the other courses that I attended that had equality and diversity thread through it, and so that was those 2 courses, and again even on top of that would be stop and search as well.
When did you attend this course?
In terms of the Terrorist Detention Centre?
Terrorist Detention
Yeah, that was
Centre.
22nd of March 2012, so within 5 years of the initial equality and diversity training.
And you say there was input and background about terrorism, about ideology, depending on the ethnicity of people coming in, faith, religion. Tell us what you meant by that.
And I think I'd made it tangible to the custody training. So any person that we're bringing in to custody for whatever reason, it's the care and welfare and whatever, in terms of the vulnerability, but also any other needs in terms of their time within custody. That could relate to obviously medical background, etc. So again, from my brief time in custody, having people coming in that require to pray, require copies of publications, that again we have to have that awareness that could be asked of us in terms of, and I suppose it's more that kind of ESH, kind of the human rights element of their time in custody and how we treat them.
And we have heard some evidence from Brian Geddes, an officer who was a custody sergeant in 2015, and he gave evidence about being aware of different types of food that may be required by individuals in custody. And you're talking about religious materials. Would that include like religious texts, books?
Yes.
That type of thing. And so this is something that you've also had specific training in relation to?
Training in specific to the post, but awareness raising in terms of wider equality and diversity associated with that.
And I'm interested in the fact that it's at the Scottish Terrorist Detention Centre. So it sounds like there's quite a lot of training being given focusing on people's ethnicity, their faith, their religion, but this is all linked to terrorism.
Yes.
And tell us about how that impacted on you in terms of understanding the factors that might be relevant to terrorism.
It didn't, to be honest, because I was more, I suppose at that time, there was processes in terms of activating the detention centre itself. Again, there was just a little bit background of, I think at that time, just the landscape in terms of counter-terrorism. Again, just from an awareness perspective, and also the considerations that when people were brought into custody from whatever background, is that whatever reasonable adjustment and considerations needed to be taken into account.
I'm interested in whether you're talking about training generally as raising awareness
Mhm.
for you and other officers. And you're talking here about being trained in relation to people with different religions, from yourself, from other religions around the world. Was there an impact in being taught about that in the detention centre and thinking about terrorism? Did you connect people of different ethnicities, different faiths, different religions with the association of terrorism?
No, and I wasn't taught about religion. I was taught about the concept and process about the detention centre. As part of that, there was awareness raising around the CT landscape, and whether it was from a experience of previous activations of what considerations we needed to consider. Again, I had the coordination function as part of that. You would still have your custody staff who would effectively be in charge of that element. It was, again, simply awareness raising. There was no training on separate religions. I just recall the kind of generic overview that was provided, whether the background in terrorism, whether that related to religion, ideology, I'm not sure.
So what were you taught about religion, insofar as you mentioned it there? What do you mean by that?
It was referenced. I wasn't taught anything about religion during that course.
And what information and guidance were you given on how to deal with people who may be of different religions?
So again, and as they would come into custody, what they may be required, so in terms of the rights of an accused, which again expands to any person coming into custody, whether they did require the use of an interpreter, an appropriate adult, how we facilitate, I suppose it's how we best facilitated their time within that environment and what their rights were, and how did we ensure that they obtained those rights and any other provision of what they required.
Were you given examples of Muslims and how they may need to be treated in a different way?
Potentially, but I think it's just as you explained earlier about if they needed, again, Bible, any other publication, prayer mat, provision of praying, if that was required.
Were there examples given about people who may be members of the Church of Scotland?
I couldn't recall.
Do you remember any examples given?
Not specific with that, no. But likewise, I don't recall specifically Muslim either.
As part of this course, did you subsequently make any association or connection or link in your mind between people of different faiths or religions and terrorists?
No, I think the takeaways was what function I would be performing if it was activated and I was required to attend, which was more procedural. And the reality is I wouldn't have had any involvement or association of the people coming into custody. There would still be the custody provision for that, for who they are obviously trained appropriately.
Thinking about unconscious bias, do you think that this created any unconscious bias in your own mind?
From what I was being told in terms of the kind of threat picture or the kind of CT landscape, I'm not sure. I don't recall that I had any strong views or takeaways from it. Again, it was there for. By introducing that, I was just trying to demonstrate that, void of any bespoke equality and diversity training, there was threads and considerations round about the wider equality and diversity of other courses that I'd attended.
You've mentioned Dame Eilish Angelini and a working group. And I think if we look at paragraph 24 in your inquiry statement, you formed part of that working group. We may hear more evidence about this later in the inquiry, But I'm interested in your experiences in the working group. Could you tell us a little bit more about the role that you took?
Yeah, so as I say, I think, as I recall, that potentially not the full report, but some form of interim report had been published just as I'd commenced my role in PSD, which contained a number of recommendations. So obviously the management team at that time set up a working group where we would effectively consider and work through the associated recommendations. There was a number of elements and categories to that, and I was given the policy and guidance associated recommendations to progress.
And what did that involve, the policy and guidance recommendations?
I can't recall the specific wording of the recommendations. However, what it caused us to do is reflect on the standard operating procedure in terms of complaints against the police. I do recall a number of part of the recommendation was looking at more of the kind of accessibility element from the public to making a complaint, but also having received complaint round about reasonable adjustments as well. Again, I don't know from what sources they drew the information from to provide those recommendations, but I assume some form of feedback, like earlier, in terms of how we learn and how we adapt.
We'll maybe hear more about this in the future. But did you, in terms of your role, how would you describe it? Was a leading role in relation to policy and guidance?
So I had the lead for policy and guidance, so the working group would be the overarching for all of the different strands and the recommendations. So I took the policy element away, effectively had another subgroup where we considered the approach that was required to potentially address the recommendation, which mainly, as I say, involved the review of the standing operating procedure. As part of that, we consulted with partners, including PERC, Crown Office, to revise it, and then obviously consult Benchmark as well in terms of other police forces and organisation.
You mentioned complaints from the public. Was it only from the public, or could it be from police officers themselves?
It was the whole complaints against the police process. So it involved every element, from the public to also the complaints against police officers on duty, off duty. So it was the full operate.
So it could be any complaint against a police officer,
Yes.
from any source.
Yes.
And there was an interim report in 2019.
I think that's what I'm referring to, is obviously the timing of me coming to PSD, because I don't think the full report was published until later that year.
Did you continue once you went into PSD in this work that you were doing?
So that was as I came into PSD, that coincided with the interim report. So I think the summer of, was it 2019?
2019.
Was when so that coincided with the interim report. So that was basically again one of my first jobs in PSD, as part of getting to know the kind of the day job.
Right.
And that I basically had that for the 2 years that I was in PSD.
And then there was a final report in November 2020. You were still in PSD
Yes.
at that time. And recommendations were made. So in your statement, can I just be clear, you were involved right throughout when you were in PSD?
As part of the working group, yes.
As part of the working group. And you were involved at the interim stage and at the final stage?
Not so much the final stage, because I'm not unsure of the fact that the recommendation relating to the guidance was discharged. Obviously there was a revised version of the standing operating procedure submitted before I left. I'm unsure obviously what happened since then in terms of discharging that recommendation, but I suppose as part of any review we would have to evidence of the work that we've undertaken, and either discharging or potentially if there's circumstances that we can't.
So there may have been changes made, but up until the interim report in 2019, you were the lead on the policy and guidance group?
From 2019.
From 2019. Yeah. And so in your statement, I think you give us some summaries of recommendations that were made at that time.
Yeah.
What did PSD or Police Scotland do with the recommendations when they came out? Or do you know?
So again, I didn't lead on the wider report. I just had one strand of it. But I know, like any review, we would look for potentially quick wins, but also not knowing how long the review had been going on for. Sometimes, not saying the delay, but for the time for the review commencing to when it's published, the recommendations may have already been met by the changes in policy and how we've evolved or matured as an organisation. But I did think they were kind of categorised in terms of potential quick wins. It's kind of the short term, medium term, long term. But I know there was obviously a bit of consultation with the review team in terms of clarification around some if they weren't clear. But also, I think from understanding, a lot of them potentially weren't for the police or within the control of the police to change. I think was a lot of kind of cultural, societal issues that were associated with the recommendations. Naturally, as an organisation, we could do as best to potentially mitigate that within the organisation, but I know a lot of them did obviously go into the kind of wider society.
Do you know what role PSD had in responding to the recommendations in either the interim report or the final report?
I would imagine if the report was issued to the Chief Constable, I think given the nature of the review, it was for PSD to lead on. No doubt the updates and any report response would have been routed back through the Force Executive. And I don't know what the obligations were in terms of response. Naturally, we would respond in writing, probably to demonstrate the actions that we've taken. Whether there was a frequency to that or just one final report, I'm unsure of. But as the meetings went on, I could hear through the discussion that we were of the view that whatever relevant recommendation had been discharged or we thought it discharged because we'd implemented or taken this action.
So it wasn't just quick wins that were the aim. There was a long-term
Yeah,
process.
I get a feeling that some recommendations potentially refer to deep-rooted issues. One, again, potentially within the organisation and also society.
But PSD would have had some...
They were the lead on that on
lead.
behalf of the organisation, yes.
So if we go to PSD, we could probably get more information. They would be the best option. And how would you describe the general awareness of Dame Eilish's reports, interim or final, in the service itself, not just amongst the PSD department or not just amongst the Chief Constable and senior officers, but generally in relation to lower ranks?
It's difficult because I was involved in it. I suppose from the kind of the wider organisation, I'm not sure. Whether there was internal communications. Naturally, there was notifications that are in the public domain in terms of media around that. Again, with the volume officers we've got, whether one, they picked up on that, whether that really, I'm not saying interested them, but because it wasn't their day job, they might not have been aware, potentially.
Was awareness again raised through the intranet?
Yeah, and I think what I think would be more important to me, the awareness of it, but I think more so the result in actions from the recommendations. And that, again, whether that related to policy guidance processes, I'm unsure.
What are you aware of what difference it made on a day-to-day basis, the reports? Did they make a difference to constables going about their business?
I wouldn't imagine so.
I don't think so. And what impact, what was your perception of any impact these reports had on the day-to-day business of the police officers on the ground?
I think because we were made aware of various reports from various organisations, or that I don't think to officers it would be the resultant action that we required to take to discharge the recommendation in terms of any implementation of whatever measure it pertained to.
Can I ask you about another report that Dame Eilish prepared? And I don't think you were on a working group on this, but it was earlier, and it was in October 2017 that it was published. It was a report on deaths and serious incidents in police custody. And I'm wondering, generally from your awareness of the service at that time, what impact that report had on the day-to-day work of constables on the ground?
As I said, the publication of a report for operational officers, I think it would have no impact. It would be the resultant change or action from those recommendations that we implemented, that whether they knew that was a result of a report, that a change in process or update in procedures, whether they'd be aware, I don't know. I suppose to them, would it matter? And if it did, I suppose it would be the onus was on us as an organisation to make sure we clearly articulated that in any communication.
Now, I know that this was a period prior to you becoming Chief Inspector in PSD, but did you have any awareness or any knowledge in October 2017 of involvement by the PSD in relation to responding to that earlier report from Dame Eilish?
And it's not even I can't even say it's a report given the role that I undertook and my involvement with PERT going forward from 2019 in terms of those matters. It's not, I don't think I'm even aware of that report.
Right. So even now, today, that's not something
No.
you are aware of yourself?
No.
Can I ask you about recognising racism or racist behaviour or racist language? Do you feel you're in a good position to recognise that in others? You obviously have line management experience, and I'm interested in your views on that.
I'm probably better placed now from my time in PSD. Again, it was just by my involvement in that nature of business in terms of complaints against the police. So I'm better placed now than I would have been in 2015.
And without that time in PSD and without your recent training, how would you feel your skills were at recognising racism?
Again, I appreciate the kind of the onus and responsibility of the organisation to provide us with training on various matters, but I think void of that, there's the kind of personal moral obligation as me being a member of a community myself in terms of recognising the rights and wrongs, probably more through society, the media, as opposed specifically to anything that I've learned from the police. I mean, as I say, I've explained in terms of being, or as a parent, a boy growing up, I'm not reliant on what the police are telling me to know and try and install in him what's right and wrong and how I expect him to act and how, in terms of the considerations of how he treats others as well.
Now, earlier we looked at the paragraphs relating to Polish people and Eastern Europeans, and as soon as you looked at paragraph 34, you recognised an issue that you wanted to raise. Are the comments that you'd made in your first inquiry statement along those lines indicative of comments that you hear other officers making?
And just for clarity, I'd recognised that before today, just as part of preparing to give evidence. And by no means in terms of kind of plea and mitigation, I think there weren't comments that I made. It's obviously my trying to articulate to help best understand my awareness of diverse communities. Yeah, very poorly articulated. I appreciate how it's been perceived, and as I say, I've apologised for that. But yeah, I think it goes back to the inappropriateness of some of the comments over the years and how that can be perceived.
And the statement that you signed, your first inquiry statement, was taken in October and November of 2020. Sorry, let me just get the date of it. Your first inquiry statement, 133. It was taken by a member of the team on March of 2022. And you signed that statement, but obviously since then, prior to giving evidence and during evidence, you've recognised the comments and how they'll be perceived. So thinking about comments that might be made now, in 2022 or 2023, in the service, in Police Scotland, are they reflective of comments that might be made now, or attitudes that might exist?
Well, and again, I've committed that to paper, so is that evidence of that it is? Yeah, potential on my part, and again, hopefully I've explained what I was trying to achieve by that. So again, I'm probably not going to pass comment on others in terms of, again, it's how it's said, how it's perceived, again, in the subjective nature of it.
And do you feel in a good position, a better position to recognise discriminatory comments made by others?
Yeah, definitely. And as I say, I'm kind of confident enough to also receive that same criticism, but I would welcome to be challenged as well if I was to make comments that was considered by others to be discriminatory or otherwise.
At paragraph 42 of your statement, you comment, "I don't think anyone's saying the cops in Kirkcaldy are the most heavy-handed in Fife." I just wanted to ask you, is there a perception in Police Scotland, sorry, it must have been the previous statement, is there a perception that there are other officers who are more heavy-handed?
I'm just going to wait for it to come up on the screen if that's
Sorry,
okay.
I've got it as 42. I don't think anybody's saying that the cops in Kirkcaldy are the most heavy-handed in Fife. I don't see it there. Oh yes, it's the last line, sorry. I don't think you get anybody saying that the cops in Kirkcaldy are the most heavy-handed in Fife. Are there others who have a reputation of being more heavy-handed?
Well, there would be, because there'd be associated complaints. Again, and this is probably what I would require noted, is that as part of the inquiry, the format of the inquiry statement is question and answer, and it's conversational. Not knowing the question there, and obviously it provided effectively the answer, I'm very conscious about things getting taken out of context. I think it was in that to show that, yeah, as the police, we're not perfect. There is, and I don't want to say minority, but there's complaints again made against the police in terms of how they act, be it criminal or non-criminal. I think with that, I'm trying to say I'm not aware of a kind of culture of, and that's personally in terms of the police at that time in Kirkcaldy being heavy-handed. But I suppose, not being in PSD, I wouldn't know how many complaints against the police in Kirkcaldy at that time of whether in terms of assault or excessive force.
I have two other matters that I still wish to cover. They should be relatively brief, but you may
We'll
wish
do
to...
them in the afternoon then, 2 o'clock.